Photographers. Today we're going to get into a pretty easy topic to deal with. We're going to talk about race and racism. So we'll get into what it is, why it is, and of course, I'm sure we'll figure out how to eradicate it, right? Our goal should be nothing less. And you can see here it says race part one. This is something over the years as I started lecturing on this stuff. I've expanded it because this is just, there's too much to discuss to fit into one lecture. And even this stuff, I'll probably go on, about some stuff, but have to cut it short. There's a lot to cover. So this will be one of two lectures on this subject matter. But for this first one, we'll kind of just start with some definitions and getting a sense of what it is, and then also get into a little bit of that why it is, right? So let's get started. So to start with, let's figure out what the difference is between race and ethnicity. These are two subjects that quite often are used interchangeably. We'll see examples of this today. They should not be used interchangeably. They are different things, right? So race is specifically looking at, physical characteristics, right? Skin color is the obvious one. Eye color is another one that people look at. Hair color, hair texture, different, sizes, shapes of humans, things like that. So we're looking at the physical, biological differences between human beings, right? Whereas ethnicity has to do with culture, right? Your background, your people, if you want to think of it that way, right? So you can be white, which describes skin color and all this different stuff biologically, but ethnically speaking, you might be, of British ancestry or German or Russian or whatever it might be, right? So that's something that we quite often have just kind of lumped together. We've been really sloppy in terms of, when speaking of race, whether it's people being quite racist or whether it's people trying to discount racism. Honestly, what we see quite often is people don't take the time to really question these terms and define them, think about what they actually mean or what we're saying when we use one versus the other. And you can see from this, looking at old textbooks is a fascinating thing to do because it can just tell you so much about what was going on at the time. And if you look back at geography as well as sociology and anthropology textbooks from, say, 100 years ago and on, you see this fascination with race, right? And classifying humans and doing so in, what a lot of folks would argue is a scientific way of doing it. Quite often the actual scientific merit behind this is lacking. But you can see this is an example. This geography textbook from 1906, over a century ago, you've got this page showing race types, and it's problematic as you look through it. Number one, we can just look at this and see that a lot of this is looking at ethnicity, right? And in like a Disneyland small world kind of way. I just love so like the Spaniard, right? It's just you just throw a bullfighter right there. Russians, of course, they have beards, right? Because that's what the race Russian actually means. Now it makes no sense, right? Of course, why would you have a beard if you're in Russia? Could it possibly be because it's cold there, right? Like it makes sense. So yeah, all of this stuff is just complete garbage, but there was so much effort put into just classifying humanity, right? That was the whole goal. Why? Well, people are kind of fuzzy on the actual why for a lot of this stuff, but they did it, right? But we know that when it comes to race, and even ethnicity as well to a certain extent, we know that this stuff is arbitrary. Okay, And we've known this for a long time. So number one on this slide on the screen, it says race is a social construct. And I believe we spoke about this in class or in another lecture or whatever. But social construct, just as a reminder, is to say that it's made up. It's not natural. It's not biological. It's not something we find just independent of humanity out in nature. It's something that human civilizations have made up for whatever reason. Okay? And so a social construct, to say that, it doesn't mean that something that is a social construct is necessarily bad or flawed or whatever. But it's important for us to realize that, hey, this isn't inherently natural. There's nothing normal about this. It's just as a society, we decided to make it normal, right? And we need to question that and get a sense of, do we want to stick with that? Or do we want to push back against that and not do that, right? That's what we're getting into here. And then this quote I throw in, races do not exist, classifications of mankind do. I think that's useful because it's absolutely true, but you look at the date, it's 1928. Again, almost about 90 years ago, people are talking in this way. We can find examples of this even further back. We've known that race is complete crap for a long, long time. And I think that's the amazing thing, right? This isn't like some new thing. Like last year, we realized, like, wait a second, this whole racism thing is problematic and racial classification. Maybe we should question it. No, we've been questioning this for decades, if not centuries now. We need to, finally kind of take it to the next step, right? Not just keep questioning, like, well, what's the deal with this? But like really start to make some progress here. All right, so that's in part. That's why I'm of course joking when I say we're gonna solve it. With just this lecture right here, but that's part of my goal is to at the very least get you guys thinking about how not just how stupid this is, but get into well, okay, if it's stupid, why does it continue to exist? Right? That's what we're gonna cover here. Now, another thing we're going to get into is, and again, bless your heart if you're not racist. Okay, good for you. In fact, if you show of hands, students, how many of you are racist? Okay, put your hands in, and how many are not racist? Okay, so that's most of you. Putting your hands up there. That's great. Good. Go with that position. But here's the deal: even people with their heart being in the right place, they do stuff that just, again, it doesn't help anything. And that's this phrase right here, right? So this question of the human race, people say like, hey, what's with race? Aren't we all members of the same race, the human race? No, there's no such thing. That doesn't even make sense. We're members of the same species. Okay, and this is the thing where people don't question the actual definitions of words or what these words actually mean. So we're members of the same species, meaning the human that exists today is classified as Homo sapiens sapiens. We actually give an extra sapiens for modern humans, like we're the most evolved, advanced Homo sapiens to ever exist. Right? So that's what we fit into. And that species thing, I think it's quite useful. Instead of talking about race, which we'll continue to get into, it's complete crap, we need to get rid of this terminology in general, to move past it, to start thinking about things in using a different language, right? Framing things in a different way. So we are members of the same species, and that's incredibly powerful. And by species, like when we're getting into that we're the same species, we're not the first Homo genus to exist. And if you've taken an anthropology class or maybe even a biology class, you've seen something like this kind of stuff. This is Ian Tattersall's depiction of humans and human-like creatures that, have existed in the past. With the exception of Homo sapiens, nothing else here exists to this day. But you can see where we have the capital H in the period, that's the Homo genus, right? So we have a handful of these things that look similar to us, but are distinctly different, things that are defined as different species. And it gets a little fuzzy, and you can get into the nuance of this as you go on. Things like with Neanderthals, there's thought of as a different species, but there's a lot of discussion of kind of crossbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that people with European ancestry, especially, have Neanderthal DNA, running through them and all that. So there's probably a lot of crossbreeding, and the official definition of species doesn't necessarily work, and there's work to be done with all of this. But what we can see is, well, it's kind of messy, right? There are a lot of different things that have existed, but to be the same species today, like, we're the ones that survived, that were successful and have been thriving, right, for the last 200,000 plus years. And we've discussed this in here in this class, that the first human shows up in East Africa, again, roughly, 200, I think it's like 220,000 years ago. So we can see that on this map. You can look to East Africa, you see that darker area, that's where humanity arises. And that's it. That's the one spot, which really means we're all the same species. We're not the same race. We're the same species, and that's a powerful thing. We're all East African if you go back far enough, right? But then, some humans decided to stay in Eastern Africa. Others wanted to see other parts of Africa. Others went up into Europe or Asia, eventually going over to North America, South America, the Pacific Islands. And there are questions about when exactly this takes place. This isn't a settled debate at all. One of the fascinating things is that Pacific crossing down at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, that blue line and arrow. The idea that it's not simply the Americas being populated by a small group crossing from Siberia into Alaska, but there was probably some oceanic voyages taking place. So that's how people in South America were populated, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff at work to get a sense of when exactly does this stuff take place. But the end result is that we have humans everywhere. But again, we're the same species, right? That is a key thing. Now, one thing I had you guys read was Jared Diamond's Race Without Color article, which I think is good because really, primarily, it's just accessible. And, he's talking about nipples and stuff like that. Like, it gets a little sexy once you get past all the bird stuff, which, there you go. If you haven't read it, now you ought to. Yeah, you get into nipple color and those kinds of things. But what Jared Diamond is doing is to show how problematic this concept of race is when we're looking at species. And he starts with birds because it's not, as charged, politically and socially and all that, to, talk about bird races. And he gets into that, but he pretty soon moves into humans. And this idea of using color of skin or eyes or nipples or whatever to distinguish different types of people. So actually looking at DNA, it turns out that there's really no distinction between someone who would classify as black or white or, brown, whether it's, Latino or, whatever we're dealing with here. When you look at that, difference in DNA of these different racial groups, we realize it's complete crap. There's no statistical difference or whatever. And when you actually get into other stuff, you can find some incredibly weird pairings, and weird based on just what we think of as related groups. So, he looks at fingerprint variation, lactose tolerance and intolerance. He gets down into actual genetic variation. And the weird thing is, when you start to look at these pairings at the DNA level, you start lumping together, incredibly dark-skinned Africans and fair-skinned Northern Europeans, people who we would not think of as being, related or connected racially. It turns out they share a lot of genetic traits that other folks who might look much more like them, don't have. Right? So he's just really, the whole point of this is to show just how much garbage this whole racial classification stuff is. And so here's a quote from Diamond here. He's saying racial classification didn't come from science, but from the body's signals for differentiating attractive from unattractive sex partners and for differentiating friend from foe. Okay, so what he's getting at here, right, this whole racial classification didn't come from science. It's the idea that there's, again, it's social construct. It's not some inherently genetic natural thing to classify and even to distinguish between, light skin, dark skin, that kind of stuff. He's saying there's no scientific basis for it. Instead, it's inherently social, right? It's the idea that it's, differentiating attractive from unattractive sex partners. And this is something, if you've taken a physical geography class with me, I get into this stuff. But when we're talking about evolution and natural selection, it's all about sex. That's just how it operates, right? This whole survival of the fittest thing, we tend to think of some, strong, tough, or brilliant, clever, whatever it might be, some, animal, let alone human out in the wilderness. We think the fittest means you're the best, and therefore you're able to not be eaten and you're able to reproduce. But the key thing is, if you want to pass along your genetic material, if you want to influence future populations, it's all about sex. You got to be able to attract that partner in the first place, and you've got to be able to reproduce, right? You've got to be fertile. So that's where it actually, he's saying it's not coming from science, but a lot of this, if we even want to look at the biology behind it, it's going to get into that fact that it's all about attractive. It's all about sex. It's all about being able to reproduce, right? That's the secret here. So there you go. What we're saying is, honestly, racism, it's ridiculous because race itself doesn't make any sense, right? Does that work? Are we cool with that? You guys get it? So race, it's nonsense. Perfect. Okay, so we did it. I think we solved race. This is fantastic. Because here's what we're going to do. So I just told you guys, right? How many people we have? 40 people in the class or whatever. Told you guys this stuff. Now I want you to each tell 2 people, right, that race isn't real and therefore racism is silly. And so you'll tell 2 people, and then if they tell 2 people, and so on, and so on, ha ha, we did it. We defeated racism. Ho ho. Yeah, that's crap, right? That's not going to work. That's not how it works at all. And there are plenty, I've been in classes where the professors kind of give this bold statement of like, race is silly, thinking that we're going to tear up our KKK membership card or whatever. We're like, oh, I made poor choices. No, it's like, okay, that it's not going to work in this way to simply discount it, right? In this way. And one reason why that doesn't work is because we just can't stop talking about it, right? Even, again, people with the best of intentions, we try to, look for these scientifically minded explanations, right? When in reality, that doesn't help at all. Okay, this is a map. This came from a textbook that I used briefly for this World Regional Geography class. It's Geography 110 at Antelope Valley College, if you're interested in taking it, where we look at different regions of the world and just get a sense of what's going on in Latin America or Western Europe or Southeast Asia or, whatever. We spend time on different regions of the world. And so this was It was from the introductory textbook or chapter trying to explain just some basic geographic concepts. And so this is looking at skin color of indigenous people as we see, which just, I mean, God, that just mapping this makes me very uncomfortable. It has a very, very Nazi kind of vibe to it. But their heart is in the right place. Now think about this. If you probably heard this kind of stuff, like what it's looking at are these trends that we have. So if we go here, in fact, let me get, yeah, a little laser looking thing here. So the equator is running roughly, here. Okay. And so with that, that's our 0 degrees latitude. It's where we have more direct or pretty close to direct sunlight throughout the year. So hot temperatures. It feels like summer all the time. And as we go further north or south, we go poleward, like toward the North Pole or the South Pole, it gets cooler throughout the year. Like we can still have hot summers here in North America, even though we're far from the equator, but we also have mild to cold winters. It doesn't feel like summer all the time. We have seasonality, right? So temperatures change. The further north we go, we see places where you get significant amounts of snow, and you have glacial ice. Snow year round that turns into this ice that covers the surface. So it just gets colder and colder and colder, right? So that's the basics of latitude and its influence on temperature. Okay, and so when you hold this up, you look at this map, the idea is that we find people with darker skin closer to the equator and lighter skin tones as you go further and further poleward. Right? That's the idea. And the white up here doesn't mean it's like pale people up here. The whitest people come from northern Greenland. It just means the no data there. It really, like, there's no indigenous folks that exist right here, right? Or have yet to be found or discovered in the past, or whatever it might be. All right. So the lightest skinned people would be up here in this kind of beige, which is, I mean, I can tan all summer. I don't even come close to that nice shade of beige right there. But it is white folks, is what it's saying, right? And then around here you have dark skin. You got black folks down here, white folks up here, and gradations in between. Okay, so that should make sense. And so the idea is people are saying, hey, yeah, this whole racial superiority or whatever, it's silly, because all it is, it's where humans evolved over thousands and thousands of years, hanging out in very hot climates with a lot of direct sunlight, or in very cold climates with hardly any sunlight at all. It's the idea that that's why we have this darker skin or lighter skin, right? If I'm here, this is where my people evolve. Again, not that I got a plane from LAX and flew somewhere into the Congo or whatever. It's not that. It's that indigenous, meaning having been there for thousands and thousands of years, but pre-modernity, right? So if my people come from here, those who had lighter skin, they're gonna fall apart. They can't handle this harsh sun. They're gonna have sunburns all the time and get skin cancer and stuff like that. You have that dark skin, that's gonna keep you alive, and therefore all the light skinned folks would die off here. The darker skinned folks would survive, right? And thousands of years and multiple generations go on, and that's why we see people dark skinned here, right? Whereas the humans that migrate up this way into, say, Northern Europe, you don't need that dark skin anymore. And so you'd have these mutations where light skin, shows up, and blue eyes and things like that. And it's, selected for, naturally selected for, and that's what people look like right up here in Scandinavia or wherever. Okay. So that's the idea. It all has to do with sunlight. That's complete crap. If you just question it, even for a moment, right? And many of us don't. We hear this. I heard this in I don't know what class, like high school science classes or whenever, probably some college level anthro classes. I mean, this isn't a college textbook right here, and we hear it and we just accept it and go on with it. But no, it's complete garbage. Number one, when you think about indigenous people and different latitudes, it's really not that good of a correlation there, right? And if you look at the indigenous folks of, say, Central Africa versus South America and up here in the Amazon or in Southeast Asia, we see distinctly different skin tone. Okay? You would assume if it's all based on latitude, everybody would be incredibly dark, right? If they come from, whether it's modern day Brazil or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or, Malaysia or wherever we are in here, we would have incredibly dark skinned people. And then the same thing up here, it would be tough to, distinguish, say, somebody from, Denmark or Finland or whatever, and, indigenous people from northern Canada, right? We don't have that. Even looking, it doesn't even have to be across the ocean. You can go, looking in East Asia. Like honestly, nobody has ever, looked at a German and gotten them confused with, a Chinese person in terms of skin tone, right? Like it just doesn't. It's not that good, right? So that's complete crap right there. Another thing is that this whole idea of skin tone, for that to be like an evolutionary advantage in terms of like sunlight and skin cancer and all that, skin cancer would have to be something that kills us before we even become teenagers, right? Because again, the idea with evolution, natural selection, it's all about reproduction, all right? So, and skin cancer is something where it affects people most often later on in life, right? You can already reproduce, you can already pass along your light skin or dark skin genes, and then later, have the ramifications of those genes down the road as you get older, right? So there's really no evolutionary advantage for dark skin other than going back to what Jared Diamond is saying, that it's, attractive and unattractive sex partners. That's the evolutionary thing. And then the social stuff, is tied into that, what we find attractive, right? There's a whole idea of, preferring blondes or brunettes or whatever, or liking, black skin or light brown skin or white skin or whatever. There's social, cultural preferences there, and that's how it gets selected for, but that's how it's also this social construct. And then this differentiating friend from foe, very easy to label one group as other or different or evil or the enemy or whatever when they clearly look different. Right? Much harder to label somebody as different if they don't have some obvious physical trait. Okay? So again, Diamond is saying this is all crap, and we can read that and go, okay, but one big problem is we continue to just buy into it. And even though this explanation is by design, it's meant to be anti-racist, right? It's meant to say, look, racism is silly. Let me show you scientifically how it's silly. It actually doesn't help. It actually continues this problem of still thinking of race as a real thing, right? As something that has some inherent natural scientific validity to it. It doesn't. So again, throw all this stuff out. All right? Whenever anybody tries to tell you some scientific reason for why some people have dark skin and some people have light skin, that isn't, saying like, because, people just thought this was sexy and that's how they have babies or whatever. When it tries to get into this kind of utilitarian stuff, it's garbage, complete garbage, and it's making the problem continue. Okay? So, if that's the case, right, if this isn't helping at all, let's get into like, why is it still here? And more importantly, why do we have racism? Right? Like, not only why are we continuing to talk about race, but why do people judge others based on the color of their skin? Right? Like, it seems like such an obvious thing. I have a daughter. She's 11 and she's adorable. And just what a a little social justice warrior she is, and how she, doesn't want to have anybody suffering around the world and all of that. But at the same time, it's so wonderfully naive. And I'm not saying that to pick on her. I mean, she's 11, right? This is where her brain should be. But she'll say stuff like, why do people judge others on the color of their skin? That just makes me so mad, right? And that's precious when you're 11. And then it's problematic when you're like, 20, 30, 40, and so on. Because, come on, it's time to, let's really get into it. Let's really question it. All right. So I think a great way to think about it is to quote Don Mitchell, who's a brilliant geographer. And this is from his book, Cultural Geography, this critical introduction to this subject. He writes on racism: if there is nothing natural about race, if there is no basis in nature for a racist social order, then it must be socially maintained. Okay? So again, we're saying race isn't an inherently natural thing. There's no reason for it to exist out in nature. Then the only way it can exist is through society, right? Through social interactions and all of that. All right. Now, this policing, referring to how it's socially maintained, takes innumerable forms as it works through our everyday lives. But these everyday practices have also to be supported and reinforced at the level of overt ideology and political action. Okay? So it's something that we might not even notice in terms of an everyday thing. And that can be, every day simply just means stuff like we don't question, right? It's just part of what we do when we wake up, before we go to bed. That's the everyday, right? So it can just be how we think about things, the actual stuff that we do. So it's ideas, it's practices, whatever. That's the kind of the mundane side of things. But there also has to be this bigger structure in place, whether it's ideology, getting into ideas in a society, or the actual, political systems and actions and stuff that go on, right? So there's a lot going on here, but just think about that, right? If race doesn't make any sense naturally, then yeah, it does have to be a social construct. But more than that, it's got to be, if it's going to carry on, the reason why we still talk about it is because it's still being constructed and maintained in society, right? That's the idea. And I think one great way to look at this too, and to really reinforce this idea that it is in fact social, is when we look at other countries. Because we as Americans, we tend to think of racism as just, it's what we know it to be. You got white folks, you got black folks, right? And you got some brown folks in between. That's kind of the extent. I mean, you can go into different colors and stuff like that, but it's really in this country, we frame it in terms of white and black. In the Western United States, we spend more time talking about Latino immigrants, and we get into those racial issues there. Asians are typically ignored these days, for a variety of reasons. Well, we talked about the Chinatown stuff. Like, that wasn't always the way, in this country and other places in North America, but it's kind of the way it is today. And we take that for granted. We just kind of assume, again, that it's the natural way to be racist. But if you look at other countries, you can see that what they do, well, it's quite different. And Brazil, they take their racism to another level. I mean, they are just the masters of racism. It's remarkable. We could learn a lot, American racists. You guys aren't trying hard enough. Be more Brazilian, because they do it right. So race isn't as simple as skin color, although that plays a big role. It's also eye color and hair texture will play a role. Okay, and it's a case that with this skin color, it's not as simple as I'll show some examples of. It's not as simple as white, black, brown. There's a lot going on. I mean, it's this amazing Crayola palette of different variations. And so because of that, because there's so much nuance here, you can have, siblings, right? Like, you can be a different race than your brother or your sister, which is incredible from an American point of view. than that could even be. But, you might have this in your own family, or you've seen it in other families where, there are multiple kids in the family and they look distinctly different, right? They're not all copies of each other and copies of their parents. They have different coloration and, stuff like that, as well as shapes and sizes and, all of this stuff, right? So that's how deep they get in terms of race in a place like Brazil. And maybe, coincidentally, maybe not, it was also the last country in the Americas to actually abolish slavery. Draw your own conclusions right there. Why they still maintain this dominance in terms of world-class racism. But here's an example. And this is it's 134 total categories. I just put the first 20, and you can see it's in alphabetical order. So that's what we're looking at. But these are different. This is different skin tone here. This is different race in, Brazilian culture. So you can see, I just love this stuff. Cashew-like tint, right? Pure white, dark or off-white. Shadow in the water. Bleached white, right? White with pink highlights. Whitewashed. Yellow. Yellowish. Burnt yellow. Yellowed. That is amazing, right? Yellow, yellowish, burnt yellow, yellowed. It's world class. I'm stunned. I want to learn more from these incredible races here. And you can see 14 here. Reddish with blood vessels showing through the skin. That means you're an alcoholic, right? Some of this stuff, it's like you could change race over time based on, drinking habits and things like that. Bluish. Deep bluish. This is amazing. Makes you want to go to Brazil, right? And just stare at people. Ebony. Very white. I like that too, because I've been described as 18 right there. But you know what I'm working toward? This is my goal. 19. Translucent. How white is that, right? That is the whitest person ever when they begin to just kind of disappear. You can see through them because they're so white. And this is ridiculous, and we can mock it. And what's ridiculous is we only mock it because we think it's, black, brown, white, maybe yellow, red. We can throw that stuff in there. But our list, maxes out at about 5. And we're done in this country. That's how you do it. This is stupid to have over 130 different skin variations here. But again, the whole thing is stupid, right? So we need to kind of keep digging at this, keep getting into what's happening. Again, we keep pointing out it's stupid. We still need to keep asking, why racism? Why does this exist? And what I'm going to get into here, every culture, I'm sure even the ones that, this hasn't been studied in, we could say have dealt with racism in some kind of capacity, right? I'm going to focus on a distinctly European and then later American racism, because that's, what we know in this country, and it's the most useful to understand here in this country in order to be able to change it, to move on, right? So we'll look at it from a European standpoint. And really, this racism, it can really be traced back in its extent here to European exploration and colonialism, that results from this exploration. You have relatively similar looking Europeans, okay? You can, definitely tell, distinct types between, say, Mediterranean, Southern Europeans versus Northern Europeans. There are distinct physical differences there, but for the most part, especially, today, from American standards, everybody's white, right? Whether you're, Italian or Greek, or Irish, or Scottish, you're going to fit into that same white category, right? And then you have people, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the British, and these different groups sailing around the world and exploring, and they're running into totally different looking people, right? And that blows their minds, as it should. That's crazy, right? To think about everything about life is contained in this little area we know of as Europe, right? And then you start to explore out further and you encounter people who are human, um, in shape and mannerisms and all that, clearly foreign, and that they don't speak the same language and have different clothings and customs and stuff like that. But they're colored differently, right? Have much darker skin and other different physical features. So that's crazy, and especially because this is well before Darwinian evolution is a thing, or even people are even really talking about evolution in general. So your explanation for how humans came to be is from Adam and Eve, right? From the Bible, from Christianity. And it's the idea, like in this painting here, and I, I love it that, or dogs and a house cat and all this hanging out too. Um, stuff that humans were actually actively breeding and developing in Europe. Painted in here. But the idea is, you have the first two humans, Adam and Eve. Of course, they're going to be white because we're all white, right? It's not even a question of what the skin color would be, or the hair color, or any of that stuff. You don't have much variation, right? You're not going to assume that they had darker skin because you've never met anybody with significantly darker skin, right? So as people are out exploring, running into darker skinned individuals, their whole concept of how just life came to be on this planet is challenged, radically challenged. So the initial explanation, it's based in a biblical understanding of humanity. Right? The idea is, okay, these darker skinned people here, they're humans, they're descendants of Adam and Eve, right? There's no question there. And so you can see there's a lot of talk about treating other people as subhuman or whatever, but still it was the idea that everybody here, right? Finding people in Africa or Southeast Asia or South America or wherever, different colonizers are running into people saying no, they're human. The reason they look like this, though, is because they fell out of grace with God. Right? God became displeased for whatever reason. They lost their way. They were no longer good Christians, so he marked them effectively. It's the idea that to let kind of everybody know, let these good European Christians know that these people, have fallen out of his good graces. That they're marked. They have this darker skin, right? So that's why we have some humans who don't look like this specific representation of Adam and Eve right here, right? And that works. That makes sense. And you could say that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But if your whole explanation for how the world works is based in the Bible, and we haven't had major scientific advancements or anything like that to this point, we don't understand not even DNA, but just this idea of evolution and stuff like that doesn't exist yet. So this works. It makes sense. And of course, it also helps to justify these colonizers then going in, taking over these places, civilizing the savages here with the interest of bringing them back into Christianity. And a lot of people early on, and we'll see this continues on later, in life, kind of shockingly so. But it's the idea that as people, accept Christ and start becoming good Christians again, their skin tone will lighten. They will become white again. They will look like Europeans again because God will be happy, right? So it kind of helps to justify this taking of land and enslaving of people and that kind of stuff. All right? And as this is going around, it's encouraging more exploration and colonization and just discovering other people. That becomes this area of fascination that leads to more and more scientific discovery, and this is where a lot of this interest in classifying humans based on race comes into play. And eventually we get past this whole Adam and Eve thing, and that black people are simply look like Europeans, and then God got mad at them. We see Europeans moving past this and instead trying to have some kind of scientific, quasi-scientific explanation for this stuff. Okay, so we shift from a religious explanation to something that's science-y, in that it sounds okay if you don't pause and question it that much, right? But it gets into the idea of, no, okay, evolution is a concept that's thought about well before Darwin, publishes his work on natural selection. So people start thinking about that. And this is where we also see this idea of latitude and skin tone. And not only is it explaining that, if you're from here, you're going to have darker skin than if you're from here, but it's a way to justify slavery, right? People here, who originate in sub-Saharan Africa, they have this darker skin. They're used to heat, and therefore, when we do enslave them and we put them out to work in the fields of these plantations, whether it's in South America or the Caribbean or up here in North America, it's okay, right? Because you had plenty of people who looked at this practice of slavery and said, this is not okay. This is bad. I don't feel comfortable with this. Even if we say these people are, not even human. That's where we start to see some of this. It's a question of, actually the reason why they look like this is because they're not actually human. They're close, but they're not quite human, right? So, kind of that's a way to get away from this whole Adam and Eve thing. But you could say, look, I don't care if they're human or not. I wouldn't beat an animal in this way that these slaveholders are doing it, or force them to work in this way. And so what proponents of the slave trade and slavery would say is that, look, don't worry about it, right? We are pasty Europeans. We can't go out into the field and work in the hot sun and do all this stuff because our bodies are too delicate, right? We're the idea people, the big picture people. Whereas these Africans, because of how they evolved in this area, because they're not quite human in the way we Europeans are, they're okay with it. They actually don't feel the heat and the pain and the stuff like that in quite the same way. And of course, that's complete garbage. Makes no sense whatsoever if you really start to poke at it. But that helped to, again, socially maintain not just, that race is a thing, but to try to ensure that it continues on, right? To make sure that people are okay with racial classification and a racial hierarchy. White folks are in charge, black folks are at the bottom, right? That they are enslaved, or if they're not enslaved, they have, no rights compared to the white folks, right? So this is part of that justification that goes on. But even this, you could say, like, look, we're well past slavery and all of that. Why do we still have it, right? We've kind of moved past this stuff, and with modern advances in understanding DNA, like Jared Diamond's article, how come we still have this issue? We're not telling these silly stories. We all know it's crap. So again, why is it still there? And I think the next good thing to focus on here is to look at what's happening in our brains when we hear something racist, or say something racist, or whatever. And a great scholar on this stuff, it's Žižek, who, if you've never heard this guy or heard of him or whatever, spend some time on YouTube. Like, you're already at YouTube, watching this stuff. Search up Žižek. He is phenomenal. Just to listen, whether you understand what he's saying or not, just listen to him for like 5 minutes. It's great. The guy's fantastic. And sweaty and ridiculous and wonderful. So what he speaks of quite a bit is ideology. He actually brought ideologies back as a thing, worthy of study. Okay, and so ideology in this sense, idea is in the word, right? So it's, if you broadly define it, it's like the study of ideas, but he's looking at it in the sense of it's ideas, but it's also what we do to kind of, reproduce these ideas, how these ideas kind of, become seemingly natural, even if there's nothing natural about them, right? How we don't question them, that kind of stuff. Okay, so it's not just, this kind of mechanical look at race, or just, simply looking at the history, looking at the DNA evidence or whatever, but getting into what's going on in our brains, right? And therefore what's going on in our everyday lives. So Žižek, the racism he's looking at is quite often anti-Semitism. Okay, so being anti-Jew, right? He's a European guy. They got a lot of that there, but it works. I mean, as you'll see as I talk about some of this stuff, you can replace Jew with whatever, right? And we'll see, some examples where quite often here in Southern California, you can replace Jew with Mexican, and it's the exact same vibe, right, for what's going on here. So what Žižek is saying is that ideology, this racist stuff, is a way to escape the reality of our desire. And he gets very psychoanalytic with this stuff. But really, what he's saying here is that this figure is a stand-in. Okay? So black person, Hispanic person, Jewish person, East Asian person, like whatever it might be, that when we say that in a racist way, when we say that like we're all just spouting just pure racism all the time, but like let's say you're racist, okay, and you say something about Jews, you're not talking about an actual Jewish person, right? There's a good chance you've never met an actual Jewish person, or if you have, it doesn't even matter that they're nothing like what you're saying. It's, in Žižek's own words right here, it's the ideological figure of a Jew is a way to stitch up the inconsistency of our own ideological system. So it's like a way to account for inconsistencies and logical fallacies and stuff like that anytime with our own greater ideological system, whatever that might be, this bigger structure of we're looking at, American democracy or capitalism or whatever it could be that we're looking at. We can, if something doesn't quite make sense, if we're racist, we can say, oh, well, it doesn't make sense because of Jews, right? And even that doesn't have to make sense, but it's like a pressure valve, right? It's like a pressure release where you can, this isn't quite where Jew, and then it's good, right? And you can move on with your day and the world makes sense again, right? So down here, any idea that seemingly threatens an ideology will be converted into evidence for support if the ideology has truly taken hold. And that's the other thing with ideology. What makes it work is that it's invisible, or pretty much invisible. We just don't see it. Okay? Like we don't see the air around us unless something went horribly wrong. It's polluted in some way or whatever, right? But it's there, right? But we rarely question it unless something goes wrong. That's what ideology is. It's our way of seeing the world, of functioning in the world, accounting for things, processing information, right? And it really works when we just take it as, well, that's just the way it is, right? That's life. That's how the world works and that kind of stuff. We'll be challenging a lot of this throughout the rest of the semester. We get into development and why some countries are wealthy and others are poor, right? Or suburban living, the way we treat urban areas in this country. Where just look around where you're living here in the Antelope Valley, or just in suburban Southern California in general. We quite often just take that as, well, that's just the way it is, right? But that's a lot of that is the ideology itself at work. Okay, so this gets heavy with stuff. Don't worry. Too much of this stuff isn't quite making sense. But it's the idea that really with racism, I think the best way to fully understand it and therefore fully be able to combat it and to make it so it's not an issue, is we have to take this whole ideology concept seriously, right? This whole rational explanation. And again, it goes back to that idea of what if we just told these anti-Semitic people or these, horribly, racist Klansmen or whatever, what if we just told them that, hey, blacks and Jews, they're actually not like this, huh? And we tell them about East Africa and we tell them about DNA and all this. Like, it doesn't work, right? This doesn't actually logically work to speak in a rational way, and that's because it's all ideological. It's all weird psychological stuff going on in our brains. And you can see that. I mean, if you just question like the bare minimum of these racist positions. Like here's another quote from Žižek. In the eyes of a racist, immigrant workers who steal our jobs are simultaneously lazy and overdiligent. They work excessively for low wages, yet simultaneously they seem to work too little to exploit our healthcare and welfare systems. Right? It's the idea that we don't want to let these immigrants in here because they're taking American jobs. And even though they're taking American jobs, they're also lazy. They'll, get on welfare. They'll take food stamps. They want to take all this stuff from us. But of course, the whole reason they're here is because they're taking our jobs. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But quite rarely would somebody say something like this and even think that it doesn't make sense. And if you even point this out, they would say, well, I mean, immigrant workers, he's again, speaking in the European context, but here you could, have somebody say this, put Mexican worker just right in there, and you could point out the inconsistencies, and they say, well, that's just how Mexicans are, right? And then but there's nothing you can say. That's like, kryptonite to reason, right there. So that's part of it. Okay. That's the frustrating thing. And again, looking at, this from an ideological standpoint, quite often this racism, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It's not the case where somebody just thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be racist against these people over here. There's usually something else at work. And again, dealing with anti-Semitism, and in this case, dealing with Germany, in between the two world wars and the rise of Nazism and all of that, we could look at something like this, and there's plenty of this stuff in Germany, published in newspapers and around the country. And what this is saying is you've got the banker on the left here. If you can't read the German here, so you've got the banker right here, stuffing himself, eating all this stuff. We've got the the government right here feeding the banks, and then the people, right, who are starving. The bone, very skinny, tattered clothes, all of that stuff. And of course, with the banks, it's not even subtle. Here with these little Star of David, buttons on the jacket right here. But this is it's saying without saying it that Jews are the ones running the banks. Okay? And you see a lot of just this, the grotesque features and all of that. Jews were seen as just being, grotesque looking people, and slovenly, even though, with all this wealth and all this stuff, at the expense of the good, Christian German people, right? And the government in control, read not the Nazi government that will come in, but the ones that the Nazis replaced, they're letting this happen, right? Which is why you need to give these people the power. That's the idea. So if we look at this, though, that's not just, coming from nowhere. This is based in the economics of, the war-torn Germany, in between World War I and World War II. But what Žižek is saying is that this racism comes from the fact that it's capitalism in general that is failing the good German people, right? It's not this, society of Jews who have this conspiracy to, steal from them and all of that stuff. It's capitalism is the problem. That's why these people are suffering. If the banks have, too much money and the people don't have too much money, it has nothing to do, whether you believe in Jesus or not. It's a capitalist issue. But we can point to the Jew as doing this so that we ignore the problems of this other ideology, of this other way of thinking of the world. Like capitalism is full of problems, which we should all admit, whether you love it or hate it or whatever. And during this whole COVID-19, quarantine, self-isolation stuff, it's becoming quite clear how some of these issues exist, right? Whether you think that, like, if we fix these, capitalism will be fine, or other people say, we got to tear the whole thing down, come up with something new. Like, it's irrelevant to the idea of the Jew in this case is being used to, to point out, or to not point out, to hide the fact that capitalism itself has some problems, right? I don't want to draw any obvious conclusions here, get too political, but it's like the whole calling it the Chinese virus thing, right? This whole coronavirus, COVID-19. The idea there are a lot of people calling it the Wuhan virus or flu, or even Kung flu was something used by upper members of our government. Charming. But you can see, that's such a great example of how this works. Like, it's very obvious today how some people can use this, and it's a way to consciously deflect, issues from our, existing systems and all that stuff. Or maybe it's an unconscious thing where some people just, blame the Chinese on this stuff, and that's what they focus on rather than, looking at the problem itself here in this country, right? Just something to think about. Some connections there you can play around with while you're, stuck at home doing nothing else. Here's some more examples of the inconsistencies and also tying in with anti-Semitism. It's bizarre, I think, from an American standpoint, like some of this anti-Semitism, but at the same time, you can kind of just replace, Jew with any other figure that's had to deal with racial prejudice here, and it kind of makes more sense. But it's this idea that Jews, like, on the one hand, were grotesque, disgusting people, and you can just see the way they're drawn here, just, not the most attractive looking men, yet at the same time, they were so powerfully seductive that they could, charm our good Christian women and eventually, seduce them in a way of not just like saying like, hey, how you doing? But, make them, white girl slaves. That's a big concern that good white Christian folks always have. And if you remember back from our Kay Anderson Chinatown stuff, that was a concern too, right? All these white girl slaves, the prostitutes and stuff like that. It was always these grotesque Chinese who were subhuman, who were awful, such an inferior culture, and yet at the same time, pretty powerful in that they could, brainwash our beautiful white girls, right? Makes no sense. Doesn't need to make sense, because that's just how fill in the blank are, right? This is just how Jews are. This is how the Chinese are, and so on. So it makes no sense. That's racism for you. All right, so there's a little introduction right there to some of the ways to think about this stuff. But now I want to get into this pillar of great academic work. He says, oh so sincerely, I want to get into how this stuff kind of gets reproduced, right? And to connect some of these issues of science, social constructions, ideology, and all of that. And I think a great way to do this is through this book, The Bell Curve. Okay? And this, I first heard about it. I maybe heard about it in 94, didn't pay much attention to it. But it was later, going back to Don Mitchell, I quoted from before, in his book, Cultural Geography, which is a fantastic book, he introduced me to the bell curve, like, and what crap it is, through there. I've since read it myself. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it's a fascinating book in just how bad and wrong it is, and yet how influential it's been and how powerful it is. And it kind of goes to show, again, what ideology is and how science and reason and all that doesn't necessarily have to exist. It's simply it's again it's all nonsense in our brains. We're just kind of helping shore up our own ideologies through stuff like this. Okay, so the book, it's written by Richard Herrnstein, Charles Murray, and Herrnstein died, I think, before this book even was published. Murray's still alive today. See examples of that in a moment. But these were two, well-trained Ivy League individuals. Herrnstein was a professor at Harvard, I believe. I think he was at Harvard. And Murray was a student at Harvard. He's an undergrad. I think he got his PhD from MIT. And Murray, still, he works for a think tank, the American Enterprise Institute today. So, these are well-trained individuals. If you just look at their resumes, you think, yeah, these have got to be smart guys. Okay? So they write a book together called The Bell Curve, all about intelligence and what that means for life in America. Okay? And it's the idea that intelligence is a genetic thing. Okay? And so, it's in us. We're born with it. It's in our DNA. But it's a way to look at the fact that, this natural variation that we have in terms of intelligence that actually helps to explain American society. Okay? And it's really, you don't see anything about race on the cover here. It's class structure. They start with class in here, but they they play around with race. They hint at it, they poke at it. It shows up, right? Race comes in here. But if you ask anybody about it, they would quickly say, hey, no, it's not about race. It's about class. But it's totally about race, right? So we'll get into some of that. Now this is kind of weird. This is a link. If you look, I think I've got this on Canvas for you guys. This is an interview that's Charles Murray right there. So this is a YouTube video. And in fact, it's kind of weird. I don't even know. Can I do, oh wait, let me do this. Can I make this play? Oh, it's going to go here. All right, don't worry about it. This is just kind of weird. You're watching this on YouTube, seeing some YouTube and all that. But it's the idea. Oh, God, forget it. I got ads. Forget it. But it's Murray being interviewed. I think this one's by Tucker Carlson. And it's right after he went to speak at Middlebury College. I want to say this was in 2014. And he got booed and then attacked by students. And he's being shocked by it. But the students didn't want him speaking. They were calling him racist and anti-gay and stuff like that. And he's just shocked, right? That if they read the book, they'd know that's absurd. And it's not even like The Bell Curve from the 90s. This was his latest one. I can't even remember what it's called. It's something about the white working class. I read that one too. Oh, it's garbage. And he's saying stuff like, I don't know, they're calling me anti-gay. Anti-gay, that's crazy. And he can't understand why. And it's because he's anti-gay. It's because in the book, if you actually read it, which I did, so I can say this stuff, he'll say how it's heterosexual couples, specifically Christian ones. I think he gets into that too. They raise the best kids, basically. They're like single mothers. Bless your hearts, you can be trying. It's just you need that man there, right? You can't raise a kid without the man and the woman. And you could say single fathers, you'd need a woman too, but he doesn't even get into that. And also gay couples. Look, you may be coming from a good place, but you just can't raise kids properly because you need a man and a woman, right, to raise the kids, which is, he doesn't give any evidence for this, or the stuff he does is very weak right there. But that's why people call him anti-gay, because it's flat out said that gay parents aren't as equal as heterosexual parents with no real proof of this whatsoever. So this, I would play it if we were in class itself, but you can look it up. He's a fascinating guy. He's like a hero on the conservative right. Tucker Carlson of Fox News is talking about him as this brilliant scholar, and he's an enemy of the left. The real problem is so few people have really addressed his work. And he'll point that out. Nobody reads my stuff. My thing is like, you don't need to read his stuff. You can know that it's garbage without reading it. Like, I've never read, Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. I still know Hitler was a bad guy, right? Like, we don't have to hold off. I'm not waiting to, make up my mind on Osama bin Laden based on his memoirs or whatever, some academic piece he published. Like, there are other ways to find out how, bad people are. But the problem is, and what amazes me, is just his work in general, from an academic standpoint, is crap. It's complete crap. And so that's how we can say he's not that great. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is show how this guy is held up as being brilliant, because of, the Harvard MIT stuff. It's really, he's doing garbage work, but it's helping with this whole ideological way of maintaining this social order and racist order in this country. Right? That's the idea here. Now, before we get into the bell curve, I'd like to bring up this article, and this was actually the very first thing I read in grad school. Okay? And so it's called Agents of ICE. I think I put a copy of it in Canvas for you guys to look at if you want. But as you read it, and it kind of won't work because I'm going to spoil it for you right now. So I guess if you want, pause, go read it, and then play this again. It's a pretty short article, but it's in this geography journal area, and it's really the underlying theme or thesis of it is that teenagers cause winter. Okay, that's their bold claim here. And what they've done is they've taken population data, and then they've taken weather data, and they see that in areas around the United States where you have a high number of teenagers, you also have cold temperatures, right? So therefore, it's the teenagers that actually cause winter. And so keep in mind, I'm reading this. My professor has not said anything about, like, by the way, this is wacky. So I'm just reading it and hearing this, and I'm thinking, what is this crap? Starting to think maybe I made a poor choice in selecting this school because this is obviously garbage, right? But no, you start reading and it becomes clear as they just get sillier and sillier that this is satire. They're being ridiculous. I don't think they ever actually give it away, but they just, they're saying stuff like, in teenagers, the reason why they're causing winter is because of their icy hatred for their parents. And you can see, if you hear their language, they'll say things are cool. Like they're giving it away that they're causing these winters to take place. It's complete garbage. And what it's trying to do, the whole point of this, is to prove this whole, very basic concept of, correlation does not equal causation, is what we typically say, right? So meaning that just because you see two things happening in the same area doesn't mean that one is causing the other, right? And honestly, I mean, it's, the reason for this is, I forget the full details. It's been a while since I've carefully read the whole thing. But, it could be just, they're picking more cities in, the Northeast or whatever than they are in the, Southwest of the country. I mean, it can just be bad sampling itself, or it could be, if you actually look at population, distribution of this time when they're looking at it, that, you just have more populations in colder areas. And when you have just more people, you're going to have more teenagers and, that kind of stuff. Like, there are a bunch of ways to explain why you see the cold temperatures and a high number of teenagers in the same space. But just because you see it, it doesn't mean one caused the other to happen, right? That's the general idea. We learn this early on in college because it's an important thing. Charles Murray, though, Richard Ernstein, did not learn this at all, clearly, because that's basically what the bell curve is all about. They take these two things, find them in the same place, and then go, by God, one had to have caused the other. Okay, so here's the argument in this book. First, intelligence is innate, meaning that it's inside us, it's natural, it's genetic, and we can see it can be reflected through IQ tests, right? So you can have an IQ test. That value you get, your IQ, it's a representation of your biological intelligence, right? The stuff that's in our DNA. So that's what they're saying. And that when you look at this, when you actually test IQ, turns out that, of course, IQ is going to vary by individual, right? I could have, 10 people in a room. I give 10 IQ tests. I'm going to have 10 different IQs in there because we're all, distinct individuals. But you can also see that there are differences by group. Okay? When we start with the book, group means class, okay? Economic class. Okay? And what they find is that smarter people are in higher economic classes than dumber people, right? It's the idea that if you're smart, well, that's going to pay off for you. You're going to get a good job and make a lot of money, and you're going to work your way up and be higher up in terms of economic class. And if you're dumb, well, nobody's going to hire you. You're not going to get through college or whatever. You're going to sink to the bottom, and so you're going to be poor, right? So effectively what they're saying is that if you're wealthy, it's because you're smart. And if you're poor, it's because you're dumb. I don't see any problems with that whatsoever. I don't know. Do you have an issue with that? That's not insulting or obviously wrong at all. But this is what they're saying. Look, hey, the data are saying it, right? It's a huge book. It's 600 pages or whatever. It's a massive thing. And they've got all sorts of, data and charts and appendices and that kind of stuff. Like, it looks scientific as hell. And they're pointing to these numbers. It's not that this is not how they feel. It's the numbers don't lie, right? That's their argument here. Okay, so again, this is all this intelligence stuff. It's all natural, innate stuff. It's in our DNA. Okay, but just like with mutation and variation and stuff like that, you could have dumb parents, right? Mom's dumb, dad's dumb. They have a kid pops out smart, right? Just, through the luck of DNA combining and all that. I think that's how most of us feel, right? Our parents are complete morons. We come out brilliant. We're totally different than them, clearly. So, you can have these little, I don't know, miracles or whatever, but still, okay? So what they're saying is, just because you have dumb parents doesn't mean you have to be dumb, but they're saying we have this geographic separation. Okay? It's the idea that poor people stay with other poor people, wealthy people stay with other wealthy people, and so therefore, the chances of this miraculous, mutation happening pretty slim. It's just going to be more dumb people making dumb babies, whereas the wealthy people, they're going to, breed with other wealthy people and make more smart babies. Okay? Again, this all makes perfect sense to me. Okay? It's not until chapter 13 where we introduce ethnic groups. So we get out of out of class, and we get into race, although they call it ethnic. Okay? And it's a very weird thing because they have, like, Jews are one classification, which Jew is not a race, it's a religion. So it could be an ethnicity, but even that, there are different types of Jews, whether you're coming from, Eastern Europe or Southern Europe or wherever around the world. So even that's fuzzy and weird. And they don't look at Christians, or I don't even think they look at Muslims or anything like that. So that doesn't make sense. But so they say ethnic, but it's really race is what they're getting at. And one of the big, key things here is that African Americans score 15 points less on these IQ tests than white Americans, right? So again, we're saying that IQ, it's a natural thing. It's in our DNA. And if we look at the test results, we see that African Americans are genetically inferior to white Americans. Like, there's no other way to say this. This is exactly what they're saying with this whole book, right? And they will point that if you look at, black IQ scores over the years, you can see that African American scores rise, but so do white scores. So the gap isn't closing, right? That 15-point gap isn't there. So even though Black Americans seem to be getting smarter, they're still not catching up to white Americans, who are clearly, much smarter, right? So, yeah, again, talking numbers. Don't get mad at me, right? Don't get mad at me, the author of this book, that's saying that black people are inferior. It's the numbers that are saying it. I'm just the messenger, right? That's effectively how this works. So if we really look at this, if you even, again, this is what so much of this racial stuff, if you even begin to poke at things and question stuff, you realize it doesn't make sense at all, right? Because if intelligence is genetic, right, then how on earth can we see an increase in intelligence in such a quick, manner here, right? To see these rising test scores. It's arguing that humans are getting smarter, again, genetically at a rate that we don't see in any other, you know, examples of evolution, right? Like we don't see, radical changes in bone structure, other physiological things, or even brain, like size and functionality and all that in any other way. But if we say that IQ tests are in fact, you know, accurately representing this genetic thing, means there's some kind of rapid evolution at work. So that's kind of weird. So we don't see that anywhere else. We could also say that, oh, maybe it means that IQ tests don't actually work, right? Maybe there's an issue with these things that have been, made up by sociologists or psychologists or whoever came up with these things initially. And even if we change them and tweak them, it's just clearly these IQ tests aren't a great way to get at this, genetic intelligence, right? So there's a possibility. We could also say, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, there's some other factor in here, right? That IQ, we're looking at intelligence, maybe it's an environmental thing, right? Maybe the reason why we see that wealthier people have higher IQs, right? Which, fits race works in there, but also just from a class-based thing. Maybe the reason why these people score higher on IQ tests is because they have the environmental conditions necessary to have their little brains develop as they grow up, right? They have access to early, educational, resources and preschool and tutors and things like that later on. It's like the people are, smarter, put that in quotes, because of their environmental conditions, and it has nothing to do with their biological conditions, right? I mean, these are all sorts of valid ways to question what's going on. These brilliant folks, Hernston and Murray, they never actually question this stuff. They just say, nope, IQ tests work. Race is a thing, class is a thing, this thing here, this thing there, put them together, voila, right? Poor folks, dumb, genetically dumb. Wealthy folks, genetically smart. Black folks, genetically dumber than white folks who are genetically just 15 points smarter, right? They don't really question this at all for all their supposed analysis here. Right? And of course, another issue is that race isn't a real thing. You can't point anywhere to show that, there's something really distinctly natural about being black or being white or being, Latino or East Asian or any of these other races that we put together. And there's not even a clear way to classify this stuff, right? Like if you even get into, light-skinned black folks versus dark-skinned black folks, I mean, there's no real genetic change or stopping point or starting point or whatever. It's just clearly it's this made up social thing. But again, they never question it ever. Okay? But what really is amazing is later on in the book when they start to, analyze their results. Like again, I said they don't question the, is our methodology flawed in some way, or our conclusions, are they flawed or whatever? No, they just start kind of getting into, okay, here's what this means for society. So here's a quote from, again, it's a big book, from page 520. The dry tinder for the formation of an underclass community is a large number of births to single women of low intelligence in a concentrated spatial area. And I love, Murray's got this thing. I just kind of realized this because he's complaining about single women, raising babies and how they're inferior in his, whatever that latest white America book was that he wrote. But you can see here back in the 90s, it's the same deal. Like 20 years prior, he's still, talking about single moms and how it just doesn't work. But yeah, he's saying that you've got all of these, single women just having babies. It's very Malthusian in this sense that they're just dumb women who, can't even marry the husbands to keep them around to properly raise the babies and all that. And they point to stuff. I mean, this is why we have to have, and we, meaning those of us who are intelligent, who are reading this, book here, and we get it and all that stuff. This is why we need to have gated communities, right? We need to live behind gates because all of these dumb people keep breeding and they're just making more and more dumb people. And it's like this zombie apocalypse thing where we have to go behind the gate and we're just going to have little dumb, kids from single moms, just, like bumping against the gate, trying to get in, and we'll just have to, shoot at them and all that. It's the only way that we, the intelligent, can even begin to survive. And again, it's not like we have nothing against these dumb poor people, but my God, they just keep breeding, right? I mean, the whole thing is just amazing and awful, and nobody's questioning it. It's seen as this brilliant, brilliant book. This is one. This is this is great. For me personally, all right? So think about this. If you're genetically dumb, there's nothing I can do as a professor, as an instructor, clearly I'm amazing at what I can do. The poetry that I give you and the very cleverly, sculpted assignments and tests and things like that. Like, I'm doing incredible work. But if I have to do this work for genetically dumb people, what a waste, right? College in general is a waste if you're genetically dumb, right? And again, that means if you're poor, right? Or if you're black or whatever, genetically dumb. Quote from the book: nothing they can learn that will repay the cost of teaching. Yeah. So this is just us talking here. Look, if you're paying for college and you clearly are well off, all right, fine. That means you're smart. But if I know nobody in this class would be like this, but if you had to use like financial aid or whatever, why bother, right? Because if you don't have the money to pay for college, that means you're genetically dumb, which means if we just give you this money, we being, wealthy folks, if we have to pay taxes and we have to give you money so you can go to college, it's a waste of time because you're so dumb, you're not going to get any of this information in your brain, right? Makes sense to me. Yeah, I think ABC is like 99% of the students are on financial aid of some kind. I myself not immune from that at all. It's just ridiculous, right? To think that unless you come from some, wealthy family, you clearly don't belong in college. And I think that's the thing too, where it's like, Murray is one of these guys who likes to say he comes from kind of this like, working class background or whatever. Like, there are a lot of inconsistencies here in his own life story. But again, inconsistencies don't really matter when we're talking about ideology. So yeah, this is hilariously awful as far as I'm concerned. And really, with this whole thing too, because it's genetic, that's the thing where we can effectively say, there's nothing we can do about it. It's nature. It's set in stone. All right. So while environmental influence is not going to change the amount of dumb people in a class or racial group, right? Meaning any of these programs, these like Head Start, preschool programs, or getting more resources to schools or whatever, it's not gonna help, right? It's not going to change how dumb someone is because, it's genetic. There's no changing it. But what's really a problem is that we can't change this stuff. We also have reproduction that's just continuing, okay, quite often at unchecked rates when it comes to the dumb people. So it's just going to continue to make stuff worse. And by helping these poor folks with different, programs that try to educate them, all it's going to do is kind of give them the resources to keep breeding and to keep passing along these inferior genes. Okay? I have this question here. Where have we heard this before? And just saying, inferior genes, you can list, Hitler's an easy one there. But really think back to Thomas Malthus. All right, when it's talking about population, this idea that we're going to run out of resources because of this overbreeding, and the overbreeding, it's because of the poor folks and their relaxed morals, the fact that they're not, getting properly married and all that. They just keep having sex like rabbits and making all sorts of poor babies, and it's taking resources, spreading disease. That's in 1798 when good old Tom Malthus is writing about this stuff. This is 1994, where they're saying, it's not so much losing, like food supplies and all that, but it's saying like we're wasting tax dollars and we're screwing up society and all that when we try to help the poor, the dumb poor people who, it's not about race, but, most of them are darker skin than other folks, right? We see that. I mean, this just never goes away. People keep bringing this stuff up. Doesn't make any logical sense. This was a best-selling book. People loved it. Okay, and so what Mitchell is saying as he's reading through this stuff is that this was the good old days. We're looking at America as it used to be when everybody knew his or her place. And that's a literal and a figurative concept there. Like knowing your place, where you belong in the society, right? What job you could have or not have. Should you go to college or not? Like nobody, the reason you didn't go to college is because you knew, because your parents didn't go to college and you just weren't college material or whatever because you knew your place, right? College was a place where smart, wealthy, the upper class, the elite people could go. They'll let anybody in, and it's a big waste, right? So they're trying to push for this idea of let's get back to the good old days. That's what they want to see. Okay, and it's a way to kind of, relax a little bit. We need to stop lying to ourselves that it's, not everybody's equal. Okay, when like not everybody's equally smart or could be. Not everybody. Let's stick with the college idea. Not everybody can get a college degree. All right, it's just how it is. Guys, so let's stop lying to ourselves about it and stop helping people go to college when they clearly shouldn't go, right? That's kind of the idea here. And now you could say, I mean, some of this stuff, you can see it might make sense when you kind of first hear, like, not everybody can get a college degree. A statement like that, you might go, well, yeah, I mean, I can, but that guy, he's dumb. And that guy, there's no way he could pull it off or whatever. Like, here's the deal. Let me give you the secret here. Anybody can get a college degree. Okay, and the secret to it, it's not an intelligence thing at all. It has to do with just, putting in the work, figuring out how to go to college, how to properly study, how to take tests, how to write papers, stuff like that. I mean, I saw this early on. I realized that, oh my God, this person who has a way better GPA than I do, this person who is, just on paper is way smarter than I am, he's a moron, right? He doesn't know anything, but he figured out how to go to college better than I did. He could write a better paper in the sense that it could, make the professor or the TA or whoever's grading it, happier and would check all the things and would work out, right? It had nothing to do with how much, material you necessarily know or how clever you are about stuff or whatever. It's just putting in that effort, right? So this idea that, not everybody can get a college degree, it has nothing to do with how smart you are. It has to do with the resources at your disposal whether you're willing to put in the time. I mean, the way to think about it is like not everybody should go to college necessarily when they're 18, right? Because they're not ready. They're not intellectually curious enough or disciplined enough or don't have that desire to put up with the nonsense that we make you put up with, right? But what these guys are saying is no, some people, and this is genetic, cannot make it through college. It just doesn't work, right? Because they're genetically inferior. And so rather than have financial aid and affirmative action and stuff like that, let's just keep them in their place. We keep them in their place and they'll be happy and we'll be happy. There's another quote from the book. In a simpler America, being comparatively low in the qualities measured by IQ did not necessarily affect the ability to find a valued niche in society. Many such people worked on farms. Oh, isn't that great? Yeah, the reason why people work on farms is because they're dumb. That clearly is it. And if you don't work on a farm, well, you're probably smart, right? And so this quote right here, has been taken by some people to think that it's even more insidious than even I necessarily think it is. I mean, some people have pointed to the fact that this sounds a lot like a call for slavery, right? A return to it. What we're saying, valued niche, and many such people working on farms. It certainly sounds like these, again, genetically inferior black folks. They don't belong in urban, educated, elite circles. Let's put them all on farms, and they can find some value there. I don't think, as much as I despise these guys, I don't think they're actively calling for a return to slavery. But there's some racist stuff going on here. Okay, but the whole thing with this is that it's, again, like I said, we need to stop lying to ourselves. There's this term white guilt, which is such a stupid thing, but it's a thing. And it's the idea that white folks today, like I personally, as a white guy, I don't own any slaves, right? Never have, never plan on doing it. I'm sure you're applauding at home there listening to this thing. Yeah, but I'm not a slaveholder. But this idea of white guilt would be like, oh, but if my ancestors were, or even if I had racist ancestors, which, like chances are, if you're a white person, yeah, if they weren't slave owners, they were at least they held some racist beliefs. But so it's the idea that like I feel guilty for what my ancestors did to your ancestors, so I'm going to, go out of my way to help, black folks or anybody who's been discriminated against, right, by my ancestors. Which honestly, like, it doesn't sound like a bad concept, but people, say that in like a negative way. Like the only reason why white people want to help other people is because of this white guilt. And so the racist folks will say it like it's a bad thing here. But these guys, Ernst and Murray, are saying, look, don't worry about it. The white guilt, that's nonsense. This is all, you don't have to feel guilty. This is just nature, right? This is just how DNA works. Let's stop wasting our time helping dumb people, right? And again, it's class, it's poor, it's dumb. And then as we get through the book, we introduce black with this too. Okay, so it all kind of works together. Now, you could say, okay, great. It's some racist book. Why do we care? It's from the 90s. Why are we still talking about it? Many of you have probably never heard of this, let alone read it or whatever. But the reason why we should care about something like this is that it's still incredibly powerful in American society. Now, Amazon.com, .com. Does anybody even call it that? Amazon, right? Nobody I don't say Amazon. You think I'm talking about the rainforest. So Amazon, is this behemoth, this cultural as well as economic behemoth. They have like one of the best things about Amazon is to simply read reviews by people. That's what I do. I love to see what the people are saying, and so with the bell curve. I mean, it's incredible how many reviews are there and how many reviews are saying this book is great, right? Like, it's just phenomenal, and it's brilliant and all this stuff. So these 4 to 5 star ratings where people are saying it's a great book, and they'll say, one of the lines is always, the book isn't dealing with race, but it's dealing with intelligence, which honestly means you haven't read the book, because they talk about it, even if they just call it ethnicity. It's race is in there. They always complain that liberals haven't really read the book. That's always the thing. If you disagree with me, it's got to be because you're a liberal. And that's that whole, ideology thing. It doesn't even have to be race. We can, use liberal or, conservative. We can throw those in depending on what team we're on. And it doesn't have to make sense. It's what we do to make sense of our own world, right? Or other people, this is one thing I love, is that people will complain that if you talk about race, you're automatically labeled a Nazi, and that's not fair. And that would not be fair were that the case. But honestly, the only time you get called a Nazi when you're talking about race is when you're saying some Nazi shit, right? I mean, you can't bring up race automatically and be called a Nazi. You have to be channeling your inner Nazi to get this stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff, but this is important to be aware of. And so I grabbed some of these in here, and this, I grabbed these. I'm imagining it was back in January of 2018 when I last did these. There's new stuff that pops up all the time. But you can see, like this first, remarkable insight, a long book that delivers one powerful message. It's all about intelligence, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Ooh. Yeah, I don't. That's really intense. But I guess saying that look, again, nothing we can do. We gotta stop lying to ourselves. Let's just keep people in their place, and we'll be good. Kind of reaffirming that stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of skimming through here. Yeah, read it not for the racially charged claims, but for the policy suggestions put forward by the authors. This one just gets a lot of these are vague, and kind of weird here. Yeah, this one makes me uncomfortable. They all make me uncomfortable, but they're all weird. In fact, if we go on, we get to some really good ones here. Because the people who attack it, who say, no, this is crap, some of them also clearly, didn't read it, or, again, even if your heart's in the right place, you gotta put forth some work here. But this example, 1 star, read the book based on the great reviews, but the fundamental assumptions that the book makes about IQ is incorrect. Furthermore, the novel was funded heavily by a white supremacist organization. There's a lot going on there. And, I agree with that first kind of awkwardly written sentence. It's not a novel. There aren't like characters in it or whatever. But also funded heavily by a white supremacist organization. I don't know if this guy means Harvard. Which you can't totally deny that. Google. No, but it's the idea, like, this heart's in the right place. Clearly, this is kind of weird ranting. But then to see like the dialogue that's going on. Luke here says, "I'm sure you didn't read the book, child." It's good and dismissive. The assumptions the book makes about IQ are not incorrect. Blacks are indeed dumber than whites. Whoa! Right? Whoa! That just, we're not even hinting at it now. That's the crazy thing here, is that the book is being very subtle in this stuff. Again, they're not going to outright say blacks are dumber than whites. They're saying it in between the lines, right? You hear the term dog whistle. It's brought up a lot these days. That's what we're kind of talking about to a certain extent, that there are these little phrases and stuff that by themselves are not inherently racist, but within a certain context, they kind of trigger racist thoughts or whatever. And so books like this can be used to help justify those with much stronger convictions, right? So this is this is where it's a problem. blacks are indeed dumber than whites. The fact that this guy, and I mean, sure, all this stuff is pretty anonymous, I would imagine. Like, we don't know Luke's last name or whatever, but still, it's that this guy is comfortable in writing this out, right? Yeah, it's just, this whole thing is terrifying and still plays a big role for a lot of people. Okay, and so it's an issue with this is simply this book existing gives it a lot of authority. Publishing is a very powerful thing, right? And even like today, you can put stuff online. You can self-publish books and stuff like that a lot easier than you could back in the 90s. But still, to have something published by an academic press, that's going to give it credibility, right? People are going to, trust it just based on that fact alone. And so that's why we need to be careful with what actually makes it through here and these controversial things that kind of get through. But I think a real problem is this idea of, used to call it talk radio science. I don't know how, important talk radio is anymore. Now it's all, like YouTube stuff. But still, it's this idea where you approach a problem with, you've already got the answer in your head, right? Like, blacks are dumber than whites, or, are inferior, or even poor folks are dumber than wealthy folks, or whatever. You don't go to, like, treat this as a hypothesis and prove it or disprove it or whatever. You already have this answer in your head, right? And then you go out and you find the evidence to back up your answer. So that's what the bell curve is really useful for, where you can say, you can have these already racist ideas in your mind, and you can go out and point to this book that these clearly very smart gentlemen wrote. Look at all these numbers, look at all these charts. I've got to be right, because this book right here, it says I'm right, right? And it gets into ideology. We're not looking at the real scientific validity behind this stuff. We're not going through and it says I'm right because if you look on page such and such, blah, blah, blah. No, we don't take the time to carefully go through here and question the claims. We're holding up the book like that's all that matters, right? Just the idea of this book. The fact that these, Harvard, MIT guys could publish such a thing, that means I got to be right. Okay? And so with that, this evidence, in quotes, that exists out there, this has led to bad stuff in the past. Okay? Apartheid is an amazing example of this. And so apartheid, usually, if we're actually in a classroom, I'd ask you, what's apartheid? And it's always amazing to me how few students have even heard about this at this point in time. I mean, I grew up when it was still existing, as some of you in the class did as well. So it was a thing that you were aware of. Now it seems like ancient history, although it's not that ancient of history. But apartheid was the segregation of white South Africans and black South Africans. Right? It's the idea. In fact, the best way, if you're not familiar with it, you can watch that movie District 9. I think that's the one with the alien cockroaches and all that. That's apartheid. That's what that movie is about. Where just replace the aliens with black South Africans, and that's what was going on, right? That's the idea there. And with apartheid, it was the idea, like just this idea of genetic inferiority and unquestioningly thinking about it. That's what led to it. I don't know if it was the prime minister or whatever, whoever was in charge of the country at the time when this went into policy, was saying, he was saying that he felt sad. He was sorry for these inferior blacks in South Africa, that they had to keep seeing how great white folks were, right? That they had to keep being reminded of their inferiority with our great homes and, jobs and just culture in general. So for their own, just well-being, let's keep the black folks away, right? Let's keep them out of here. I mean, they can come in here if they need to clean our homes or whatever, but still, let's keep them out of here for their own good, right? And rather than people saying, God, this is our leader is saying that? What a moron. They all, applaud it, and it goes into policy. And it's not gotten rid of until the 1990s, okay, which is amazing. Like, this is, we typically talk about, like, slavery here in this country, or even segregation. Like, we had the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which really wasn't that long ago. But at least that's, for many of us, it was before, we were born or cognizant of how this stuff worked, or whatever, right? So it seems like it happened a long time ago. The 1990s, I think it was 93 or 94, I think, when South Africa finally ended this. Nelson Mandela was the first democratically elected president, in the sense that, he was the first black president, because this majority of black South Africans were finally able to vote, and they vote him in as their leader, right? I mean, it's remarkable how much this existed, and how recently. And so just these ideas, these ideologies of racism, they continue to exist, but the real issue is they're socially maintained, right? And we have stuff like these seemingly academic books, these people who seem to be quite intelligent, but we don't actually question what's happening. We don't really get into, what's wrong with this stuff. And so going back to Charles Murray, and here, more YouTube videos that I'm not going to get into right now. With a lot of this stuff, it's the kind of thing where it's it's I don't know, it's fascinating to me, how he's still held up as this brilliant guy, as this scholar, and his books actually have merit and all that stuff. And other people say no, he's terrible. But the real issue is nobody's really dealing with what it is he's saying. I mean, a few people do have some different interviews with folks. You can just search for this stuff on YouTube or whatever. But it's really remarkable to see what's held up as acceptable intellectual subject matter, what's held up as acceptable for discussion, and what so few people are really willing to question. Right? Ideology. That's what we need to get into. Why are we ignoring the logical component of this? What's happening, as context to want us to make us want to listen to this racist stuff, or accept this or not accept that, or whatever, right? And so with this, too, this is inherently geographic. Okay, it's always this idea of a place for people, whether it's in the bell curve, or we're going to talk about next time. We'll get into segregation. We'll look at the South, Jim Crow. We'll talk about redlining and some of that stuff. It's always geographic. It's always connected to space and place and the stuff we've been talking about. And so we'll see that racism, in part of its social maintenance and the reproduction of it, it's inherently connected to place and space. Okay? But that's for another time. We've done enough here. We're almost there. We've almost solved racism, right? We're halfway there. I'll be back later to talk more about this stuff and get into more of the geographic stuff. All right? All right. Stay healthy out there.